to glean from this book some principles that help us to renew our spiritual drive, to reboot our spiritual life, to just get us focused again on things that are significant to God. We have looked at a number of things as we've gone through these chapters, and we've reached chapter 5, is where we'll begin today. But what we've seen thus far is that we need to have a different view of life trials. We need to understand that trials are intended to help us and to grow us up, to mature us in our spiritual walk. They're not enemies, they are an avenue by which we grow. We need to also understand that temptations come from within us. We are the own source of our temptations when our desires draw us away. We need to do more than just hear the word. We need to be about doing the word, as Emmanuel mentioned this morning. We need to be about fulfilling God's instruction for us. We need to make sure that we're not showing favoritism, because favoritism is not part of God's kingdom. It reveals our evil heart, and so we need to make sure that we distance ourselves from showing favoritism. The fact that our faith needs to be coupled with fruit, that our actions become the demonstration of our faith, is a subject that James goes into. He blesses our tongue, and we've seen how that the tongue literally has the power to direct our life. It's like the bridle in a horse's mouth, the rudder of a ship. And so as we gain control of our mouth, we direct our spiritual direction. We've looked at the fact that there's two different forms of wisdom. There's wisdom of the earth, which is wisdom of dirt. And there is the wisdom of God. There is heavenly wisdom. And of course, James says you've got to live by the wisdom of God. We found out that the source of quarrel and fightings always is our own pleasures. So whenever we're at odds with anyone, it's because we're seeking to gratify our own pleasures rather than to harness, if you will, those pleasures. And then we talked about the affections. James says if we are friends with the world, we're enemies of God. So that's what we've looked at thus far, and today we're not going to talk about going from rags to riches. We're going to talk about going from riches to rags, because the next text that we're going to look at has to do with wealth. Now, whenever you talk about money, people think you're talking about giving. Whenever you talk about giving, people think you're talking about what they put in a collection plate. That's not what we're talking about. As a matter of fact, what we're talking about today will determine what you put in the collection plate. This is a deeper subject than just what we tithe or what we give. This is our attitude toward the whole subject of money, and that's what James is going to address. He's going to talk about wealth. Most of us are familiar that Timothy is given some warnings by Paul about wealth, that those who want to be rich fall into a temptation. And then he says that it's this love of money that is the root of all kinds of evil. And that, folks, is exactly what James is going to be illustrating in James chapter 5. I thought this was kind of humorous. They say it's better to be poor and happy than rich and miserable. I think we actually read a proverb that was very similar to that this morning. They say it's better to be poor and happy than rich and miserable. But here's what somebody came up with. Couldn't something be worked out, such as being moderately wealthy and just a little moody? That kind of reveals some things about this whole concept of wealth and the desire for wealth. Here's our text in James. Come now, you rich people. Weep and wail over the miseries that are coming on you. Your wealth is ruined. Your clothes are moth-eaten. Your silver and gold are corroded. And their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You stored up treasure in the last days. Look, the pay that you have withheld from the workers who reaped your fields cries out, and the outcry of the harvesters has reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived luxuriously on the land and have indulged yourselves. You have fattened your hearts for the day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the righteous man. He does not resist. There are just some basic questions, I think, that arise from this text, and we're kind of talk our way around these in our lesson. You know, money talks. And the question is, what is yours saying? Okay, money speaks. So what message does your wealth reveal? Money also, it can be held with a clenched fist or it can be held in an open hand. And again, which way am I approaching what I am given by the way of finances. Money, do you possess it, or does it possess you? So those are just some general things to think about as we go through this. We're going to actually look at 3 profound truths, I think, about money. Number 1, how do we get it? Number 2, how we choose to guard it. And number 3, how we give it. And I think all 3 of those are subjects that James addresses in these verses. I want to begin with an illustration. Sometimes I hesitate to illustrate things from a book because it's like I'm giving away the plot. But if you haven't yet read The Pearl by John Steinbeck from 1946, it's time the plot be given away. So I'm not afraid this morning of sharing this little summary clip of the book about the pearl. And the reason I want to do this is because this illustrates on so many different levels exactly what James is going to be discussing. The mayhem that is caused by a desire for wealth. The turmoil that develops when wealth is one's pursuit rather than other things. The evil that the love of money produces. All of those things are seen in this story. So I invite you to watch this little summary of the pearl.
The story begins with the poor but content Kino, who adores his practical wife Juana and their infant son Coyotito. One day a scorpion stings the baby. Kino kills it, but when he and Juana take their son to the doctor, the physician refuses to treat him. The doctor looks down on Kino's race and knows he cannot pay the full medical bill. Kino and Juana then take Coyotito down to the sea. There, Juana applies a seaweed poultice on Coyotito's shoulder to treat the scorpion sting. Kino dives for oysters from his old canoe, attempting to find pearls to pay for the doctor's treatment for his son. Indeed, he finds a large oyster, which yields an immense pearl, and Kino howls with joy. Kino's neighbors are jealous when they hear the news. Then the doctor visits, offering Coyotito additional treatment. After the doctor leaves, Kino wraps the pearl in a rag and buries it in the dirt floor. The doctor returns, offering to keep the jewel safe for Kino. Kino refuses, frightened that everyone is after his pearl. That night, Kino thinks that he hears noises in his hut. He grabs a knife, striking at an intruder in the dark. Afterward, Juana tells Kino that the pearl is evil and insists he throw it away or break it before it destroys them. Kino refuses, saying he will sell it in town the next morning. After being warned by his brother not to get swindled like their ancestors did, Kino goes to sell his pearl, accompanied by his neighbors. The dealer offers 1,000 pesos, but Kino believes it's worth 50,000. He can feel the evil around him as other dealers inspect the pearl and offer similar prices. Kino refuses their offers and decides to go to the capital to sell it there. Back in their village, the townspeople argue whether Kino should have accepted the money, which was still more than he would have ever seen in his life. He buries the pearl again in his hut and becomes more terrified of the world around him. Later that night, Kino is attacked by thieves after investigating noises outside his hut. Juana once again tells him that the pearl is evil and they must destroy it. When Kino refuses, she attempts to take the pearl and throw it into the ocean. But he finds Juana on the beach and uncharacteristically beats her for doing so. Then a group of men accost Kino and knock the pearl from his hand. Juana watches from a distance and sees that he has stabbed another man out of greed and desperation. Juana finds the pearl, and then she and Kino decide to escape. He orders her to bring Coyotito and all of the corn they have. Then Kino finds that his canoe has been damaged and their house is torn up and the outside set afire. Kino and Juana hide at Juan Tomas's before setting out for the north the next night. Juan Tomas reminds his brother that he should have sold the pearl, but Kino insists the pearl has become his soul. The family travels through the night, then rests during the day, then hides when Kino suspects they are being followed. Bighorn sheep trackers are following them. The trackers believe Coyotito's cries are those of a coyote pup. One shoots in the direction of the baby's cries. Then Kino steals the rifle, viciously killing all 3 trackers with the gun and his knife. Afterward, he can hear nothing but the cry of death coming from the cave. Juana and Kino return to La Paz defeated. Kino carries a rifle that he had always hoped for, stolen from one of the trackers he killed, while Juana carries the dead Coyotito. Nobody speaks to them, and even Juan Tomas cannot bear to say a word. Now, when Kino looks at the pearl, he only sees the image of his dead son, Coyotito. Kino throws the now meaningless object into the ocean, relieving himself of the evil once and for all.
Exactly what James is presenting. So let's begin to look at those 3 principles. First of all, how do we get what we have? How are we receiving our money? The issue of how one gets their wealth is very significant in what James has to say, and so he addresses it with pretty strong language. The language that he uses indicates that the funds that people were operating with were extorted, they were exploited, that folks had taken advantage of situations and advantage of other people in order to accumulate their wealth. Look, the pay that you withheld from the workers who reaped your fields cries out, and the outcry of the harvesters. They had neglected obligations so that they could have more. That's how they were getting their funds. He says in verse 6, you have condemned, you have murdered the righteous man. There was a condemnation, there was a mindset that said, I deserve this more than you. You know, financial gain that is achieved through cheating others, neglecting the labor of others, and by becoming the judge and the executioner of others, only fattens oneself for the spiritual slaughter that is coming. And that's exactly what James says. You have fattened yourself. You've gone about accumulating all of this wealth by the means that are inappropriate, and all you're doing is making yourself fatter for judgment. Employee and employer can equally accumulate by cheating the other. The boss and the employee can both develop attitudes that I have a right to certain things. And that's what James is talking about. Jesus told of a landowner who hired workers, and he hired them through the stages of the day, agreeing to pay them a certain amount of money. And as the end of the day came, 5 o'clock, and they're paying the workers, the ones who had worked only an hour received the same pay as those who had worked all day long. And those who had worked all day long, when they saw that the ones who had worked for the shorter period of time were getting the same amount of pay that they were promised, they assumed that they would be given more. And in their minds, they become the judge, the jury, and the condemner of the landlord. And they say, we thought you were going to give us more since we endured the heat of the day. And the landlord says, it's not yours to decide. It's my business. You agreed to work. You're getting paid for exactly what you agreed. When we think about the manner in which wealth is made, it must be free from pilfering actions and attitudes. You know, Scripture is just abundantly clear that we need to make sure as employees, as people who are in the process of making money, that we do so honestly. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 28 says, the one who steals, let him steal no longer, but rather let him determine to do honest work. Do honest work. You know, there was a time when people used to talk about doing an honest day's work. You talk to people anymore who are managing larger group of people, and they say it's harder and harder and harder to find employees that are willing to do an honest day's work. But the Bible says that's the way we're supposed to be about making our money. we are honest about our endeavors. Proverbs 11:11, a false balance is an abomination to the Lord. Making money dishonestly is an abomination. It's not right to the Lord. Colossians 3 and verse 23, work heartily as to the Lord, not to men. We need to give ourselves to employment like we give ourselves to the Lord. And Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 9, being slack in work is a brother to him who destroys. The one who is slack in his work is like the brother who's setting out to destroy someone. So the Bible's pretty plain about how we're to get our money. So let's talk about how we guard our money. Again, this is a subject that James addresses. How do we guard our money? Guarded wealth promises joy, but only delivers misery. Get that in the pearl. You know, you've got this guy who is obviously, he's poor, but he has a desire for wealth, and once he gets that wealth, what happens? He thinks it's going to be the solve. It's going to be the solution to everything. It's going to solve everything. When money becomes one's love, it ceases to bless and it becomes a curse. Again, that's what Paul warns through Timothy. It's what James is talking about. James 5 and verse 5 from the New Living says, you have spent your years on earth in luxury, satisfying your every desire. You have fattened yourself for the day of slaughter. The New Century says, your life on earth was full of rich living and pleasing yourself with everything you wanted. You made yourselves fat like an animal ready to be killed. So James says we need to be careful about what we're doing, our attitudes towards money, how we're guarding it. James says that wealth, first of all, rots. Rots. It's deceitful. It's deceitful. The other day we were sitting at the table and Becky looked up at our basket of fruit and she says, is that apple bad? And so I reach up and I touch this apple and it's fine. And she goes, no, the other one. So I reach and I hit my thumb where the stem is and my thumb goes in and it's slimy. It has rotted. And you know how disgusting a rotten apple is? James says, when we think wealth is going to bring happiness, all it's going to bring is rottenness. It has that potential. It also has moths that eat up your clothes. You know how you pack away those sweaters every spring? You're going to dig them out in the fall. Have you ever found that the moths have gotten to one? And you hold it up and it's been moth-eaten. James says that's how wealth is. You guard it away, you put it away, you treasure it, you anticipate you're going to need it and use it, but the moths eat it. And then lastly, he says, gold and silver have corroded. Gold and silver have corroded. Interesting language. I actually had to research because silver, I know, silver oxidizes and it does some funky things, but I didn't know that gold could corrode. Pure gold cannot. But there's very little in this world that's pure gold. Most have an added alloy of some kind to give them strength and to harden them. That's why very few things are made of 24 karat gold. Most things are 22 because you need some strength in the gold. And when there is something added to the gold, guess what it will do? They call it tone. Gold will tone. It loses. There's a change in it. And here's James, and he says, you've got silver, and silver will oxidize. It'll go bad on you. You've got to get the polish out and polish up the silver. But even that which is gold is not pure, and it's going to corrode as well. It's going to tone on you. Jesus used a parable, you remember, about a rich young fool to portray the dangers of guarding one's wealth in Luke chapter 12. God says he's a fool because that very night his life's going to be demanded of him. And so Jesus then says, this is how it's going to be for the one who stores up treasure for himself, for the one who guards treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. The third and final principle we want to talk about is how we give it. How we give it. Those James addresses here, they are giving money. The problem is they're the giver and the receiver. They're very generous to themselves. And so they are feeling fully justified in the means that they're getting it, that are dishonest, that are inappropriate. They feel totally appropriate in guarding this all because it's theirs, it's mine. What James says is all of that's not the way it's supposed to be. It is not what we keep that makes us rich, it's what we give. Jesus actually said it's more blessed to give than to receive. There's more of a blessing in what we give than in what we keep. What treasures we guard and hoard, James has already said, they rot, they ruin, and they rust. Here's a worthy example to consider found in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. It's a group of believers in the area of Macedonia, and they've received an opportunity to help out needy brethren in other locations. And the scripture just defines and describes. And Paul says, "For I testify to you that they gave as much as they were able." Let's just stop there. Do you feel like you give as much as is able? Again, we're not talking about collection plate. We're talking about our attitude towards our money. Do you give as much as you're able? I'm not going to be so bold as to say that I do. But it is said of these people, they did. They did as much as they were able. But then look at what it says. And even beyond their ability. Beyond their ability. Entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the saints. And they did not do so as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us in keeping with God's will. You see, when we first give ourselves to the Lord, it affects our attitude towards money. It affects how we get it. It affects how we guard it. And it affects how we give it. These Macedonians illustrate that at the core, the issue of pleasing God and being God's faithful servant is to give ourselves first. To give ourselves first. So the question, are you giving yourself first to the Lord? And the truth is, Jesus said, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So, a good clue about how much you have given yourself first to the Lord is your attitude towards money. How you choose to get it, how you choose to guard it, and how you choose to give it. That becomes, if you will, a litmus test for the position of the Lord in my heart. And the Macedonians illustrate that when the heart is given first, it affects those attitudes. We are in awe of how God gives us opportunity to change our lives. That's why James is writing this book to people who've already believed in Jesus, but they still need to instigate changes in their lives and their attitudes and their behaviors. And James has been very forthright about some of those changes that need to happen. And so many of us here have given ourselves to Christ, but we still are in need of hearing those messages and of understanding the needs for change in our lives. And we can thank God that like it says of Samson, his hair began to grow again. We can thank God that when we've messed up big time, that we can still get the chance to change, to reboot, to renew ourselves.